It was an ethnographic investigation of a public works project, an effort to kind of reduce corruption. And the project I studied is called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. It's a mouthful. The acronym is NREGA. It's one of the most important welfare schemes that India has ever produced. It's 0.75% of the GDP. It's also arguably the largest employment program in human history. I've had statistics where people talk about it employs 11% of the world's population. So it's a huge program. And the essential program is to provide a basic safety net, if you will, for people, an alternate employment, who are, seasonal migration, to kind of solve that problem, to have some amount of work that is guaranteed by the state. And one of the unique aspects of this program, we've seen many public work projects before, but this is the first project where the work itself is a right. So in the sense that the government cannot come and say that there's no funds available for the project, and every family can get up to 100 days of employment in this program. And it's also, economists like to use the word, it's self-targeting, so it's not targeted. Usually you have projects where they would try and target to the poor and say it's eligible only if you meet a certain criteria. But this one is open for anybody who is willing to work, do manual work. And the way it works is that there is a set of projects that are approved by the government, and any citizen who wants to work in rural India can work, and they eliminate any machine. So it's all manual work you have to do. So the idea is to kind of build in this notion of corruption, eliminate corruption possibilities by kind of requiring people to actually do physical work as opposed to having contractors and machinery involved. So they get paid based on the number of work they do. But as Chip was alluding earlier, corruption is a huge problem, and it continues to kind of stop any public intervention. So in this case, even in there's a recent CAG audit report which said only 30% of development funds has reached people. This is in some sense better than there's a famous quote by a former Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, where he said, almost kind of jokingly that only 5 paise out of every 100 rupees, which is like 5% of the money goes to the people. So in some sense, it's an improvement, but it's a real significant problem, and the program is designed to kind of try and see whether you can eliminate corruption. And as Chip was mentioning, there's a lot of attention of using technology. So we want to, this question I pose is, to what extent can IT be used to eliminate corruption? This is a question that actually has been posed by the bureaucracy administering this program. So, very simple nutshell, this is my argument. The argument that I have is that there's no one technology fix, and this question itself is flawed in many ways. You can't look and ask a question that can IT solve corruption? And if you look at the actual effects, which I'm going to hope to convince you that the technology itself is changing all the time with active iteration and with responding to political changes and capture. So the lessons that you learn from looking at an ICT project cannot be applied immediately to a different arena, right? So the idea is to kind of can you use ICT to eliminate political capture? Well, there are limits, and I hope to show you how exactly that played out. And lastly, I think looking at projects like this, as opposed to impact studies that we've seen before, where you kind of do an RCT, where you evaluate an effect of technology on corruption, the work that I'm doing, I want to kind of make sure that it's something that's seen, is that you have to open up the black box of the state bureaucracy as well as technology to kind of understand how this plays out, and not just look at the outcomes, and to actually see day to day how technology plays in. So that's the kind of overall point I want to communicate. So as you can, got the hint in terms of methods. My method was ethnographic, where I spent about 12 months in an 18-month period, essentially kind of doing participant observation. So I lived and worked as a day laborer for 3 months, kind of trying to do the work that NREGA workers do. And I learned, I was telling somebody earlier, that the skilled versus unskilled difference. I said, well, clearly I'm unskilled, because you cannot do that labor that easily, even though it's paid lower, right? So in that sense, I had a chance to kind of engage with various worker communities, also with bureaucrats and computer operators to kind of see how this project actually plays out in the 12 months I was there. So while NREGA, which is this public works project I studied, is a centrally funded act, every state gets to ratify it. So I looked at the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, where you see the red map there. And one other point I want to mention is that in 1992 in India, there was responding to corruption charges mainly, there was a huge attempt to kind of decentralize governments. They said, well, the problem is because it's this British kind of legacy of controlling stuff from the center that the state was doing, and the Indian state was doing. Instead, we should just give powers at the local level. Let the local politicians and bureaucrats have a lot more power, money to decide projects. And in that sense, that's from 1992, the shift has happened there. So just briefly for people who are not familiar with the Andhra state administration, so you have the state, it's a number of districts, it's 23 districts, and each district is divided into what's called mandals or blocks, which each have 30 to 40 villages, so totally around 21,943 villages, gram panchayats that exist. So I'm going to use the terminology high-level politicians to describe the people, bureaucrats at the state, at the district level, and the lower-level bureaucrats and the politicians at the mandal and the villages level, right? And as you can kind of tell from this picture, the kind of, if you want to do centralization, if you want to administer a program like this, the size is huge. In fact, it's about, in Andhra, the population is, I think, 1/4 of the US population. So it's 85 million people. So I mean, if you want to administer a project where you're employing 11% of the world's population, it's a huge program to administer, and so I just want to highlight that. So the state of Andhra Pradesh itself didn't have a good record of administering projects. There was actually a predecessor to NREGA project, which is called the Food for Work project. The idea was to kind of, instead of giving money for work, the idea was to give cash. And there was a study that was done that said that, if you read the code, one of the most disturbing findings emerges from this research points to the exact point that I just mentioned earlier, the decentralization that happened in '92. They said the problem is the local panchayats and the politicians have colluded, the bureaucrats and the politicians, to kind of take the money off. So in some sense, kind of questioning the whole decentralization idea indirectly. And corruption was identified at the last mile. Last mile meaning where actually, in many ways, it's the first mile for the workers, but it's where the work happens. And that seems to be the corruption, at least in public works projects, which doesn't mean there are no corruption happening in other parts. But the talk here is going to focus more on the corruption that happens at the lower level. And one other kind of this is probably too much information, but it'd be useful to know. In Andhra, there was a kind of a political movement to ensure more control of the bureaucracy. So there was a lot more centralization possibility that was there, which will be useful to know. And while corruption was happening, the study said that one of the things, at least particularly useful in the Andhra bureaucracy, and maybe less so in the other places, that people kept documents. This is something that whether you're administering your work correctly or not, you can look at a document and say whether and it'll look fine. So the corruption gets manifested as fudging names and reporting workers who are dead or not actually worked, and kind of showing paper records as opposed to real work getting done, or exaggerating claims. Instead of reporting work accurately, you have documentation which shows exaggerated work. So corruption actually happens that way. And if you look at audits of these works, it'll look fine. It'll look like work was done and it's all good in paper. But if you go and do the actual study, you realize that the documentations were not maintained. And nobody was really looking at it. And if you look at the hierarchy, it's very hard to maintain it, and especially when you're decentralizing and giving power to the local level, right? So this is a quote from one of the senior bureaucrats who looks at this and he reflects on his like 3 decades of experience. He says, I found 3 kinds of vested interests. Politicians who get the work sanctioned, they're bringing the works to the village so that they have a share in it. Engineers and contractors who implement the works and make the estimates, they have a share in it. I have found development programs in the past. He's been, as a senior bureaucrat, he's been there 3 decades. He says, have been driven through and through by these vested interests. So I realized that, for NREGA to run, essentially his kind of takeaway message was, kind of reversing the decentralization that happened. And instead, we need to take away the powers from everybody, and that's what he wanted to do. I say it's worked, and it's very hard to kind of. I've been trying to kind of find actual corruption figures, and in terms of scholarly work, there's actually a study that has been done right now by a poverty action lab based in San Diego, where they're trying to do an RCT on portion of the project to kind of quantify the reduction in corruption. And I just was there last week listening to their kind of working paper talk. This is Karthik Muralidharan and company. They actually claim that the reduction in corruption of smart card rollouts is about 20% because of the smart cards. But this is also acknowledged by like other studies. They don't really come up with numbers. So Transparency International kind of generally looks, Andhra points to Andhra and says very favorably. And similarly, the government's own internal accounts say that Andhra's corruption has reduced. And my own kind of observation in just talking to people, you get a sense that corruption actually has drastically reduced. And in fact, the central government hails it as the Andhra model, and wants to very interested in replicating this, not just in NREGA in other states, but other public programs. So I think it's very useful to kind of know what worked and what didn't work, and that's the. So the question I kind of pose is, what is the Andhra model of open governance? So before we get there, I think I just want to give you a brief idea of what is open governance here. What do I mean by it? And the logic is very simple. It's essentially opening up records that that's kind of inaccessible. I mentioned that early on, people maintain records, but nobody ever looks at them. So the idea is to can you open up these public records, and so that the state can see it, and also increase participation from citizens. Right here in the US, you have like websites up. People put up open government websites. There in this context, you don't have that. But the idea is to can you try and open up these records which are locked up, and get the state to see it more, and so that you can have the cycle. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand. So is this a finding that came out of your fieldwork, or is this something you're?
This is just a general logic of the rhetoric of how open governance is supposed to work, right? It's not a finding. It's just more. If you look at open governance model, this is what they talk about. They say the records are usually closed, so let's figure out a way to open them up. Once you open them up, then there will be like, there's a chance to kind of fix the problem. So it leads to more accountability. So this is like the transparency leads to accountability logic, right? Which I'm going to problematize in a bit. But if you look at open governance in the global south, there are 2 issues, right? One is that you can't, even for the state themselves, you can't, take granted availability of data at all levels. It is maintained at the local level, but it's something that you can't take for granted. And then there's always a big struggle to improve quality of records, right? It's not just opening up data, but the data has to be first gotten, and then also there's a sense of knowing what the quality is. So the Andhra model of open governance, it goes beyond transparency. So the cycle that I pointed out, it talks about access and quality, right? Yes, the way that they use increasing access was to kind of use ICT, right? I'll tell you exactly what they did. But broadly, the idea was to kind of can we use technologies to increase accessibility of records at the lower level for the bureaucrats. And then the next thing, which I think is unique, which was done by the Andhra bureaucracy, was not just getting records, but also control. It's problematic, I'll tell you in a bit. But it's not so much to know the records, but is there a way to kind of centrally control the everyday practices of the government and using ICT, right? So that's the kind of addition to going beyond transparency. And the last point, which I'm not going to be able to talk to, but I'll briefly mention it, with respect to improving quality of data. What the government has done is to kind of say, well, we have all these records digitized and have it, So now let's take that data to the workers and do surveys every 6 months, and then compare what the official record says with what the workers are telling, and actually have public meetings. So it's not audits that are done privately, but have public audits where everybody in the village shows up to these meetings, and essentially the discussion would be, the record says Chip worked, last year, 20 days, right? And we'll ask Chip, hey, did you actually work that many? And how much did you get paid? He's going to say, well, yeah, I got paid, $400 or 400 rupees. And the record's going to say 1,000, right? So and then like here other people through, right? So then somebody say, oh, you didn't actually work on it. He's actually a landlord. He would never work, right? So that's the idea, right? That's the idea of actually trying to improve the quality of data. So that's unfortunately I'm not going to get to talk about it, but the overall framework, if you want to put the Andhra model in a framework, there's an idea of sandwich theory that this Jonathan Fox developed in Santa Cruz. The idea is that you put you put pressure from the top, and then you also have some amount of pressure from the bottom. The Andhra is slightly different from what Fox talked about, but the idea is to essentially squeeze the middle layer of the lower level bureaucrats, where you use IT and control of practices from the top, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in the talk, and then the contesting public records through this process of social audits, which I'm happy to answer questions later on. So that's the broad idea of the model. As you can see, it's beyond the transparency circle that I grew. It's not just about records. It's also about controlling what people do. And there's, I'm just going to go past this. There's a bunch of scholarship, scholarship I'm using, and also hoping to contribute in various different literatures. And I'm happy to kind of talk through if people are interested in knowing what exactly the contribution in each case. So the rest of the talk is pretty much going to be focused on this tussle of, I'm going to walk you through a few cases of how exactly ICT was used, and what was the resistance by the lower level bureaucrats, and how that was adopted in turn by the high level bureaucrats, and this form of iterative deployment. So that's the kind of the focus of the talk. Just to kind of get you back in the problem space. The problem that the bureaucrats are high level bureaucrats are trying to solve is corruption at the local level, right? Which is the last mile. And the problem according to them is to kind of eliminate local political interferences. And so the idea is to kind of remove powers from everybody and centralize control. And there are kind of two broad things I already mentioned, which is one is to kind of increase the visibility of work of the lower level bureaucrats using ICT, and then also constrain the practices. So it's transparency plus, if you will. And there's like technical term, Commonality, which I can talk about. So I'm going to walk you through this 3 different examples, 3 different empirical. There are plenty more if you're interested as well. But just I think these 3 would hopefully will give you a sense for what was done. The first one is, this is a picture that this is a picture of a clerk in a government building. You see a bunch of documents, which are kind of gathering dust, and this is every government office that you see. And these are stacked. A lot of documents are kept and stacked up, right? And I'm going to walk you through one document which exists here. It's called the muster roll. You can't unfortunately read it. It's in Telugu. It's essentially an attendance register. All it, for our purposes, let's assume that it has a list of names of workers who work on NRGA work site, and their work they worked on, which work ID they worked on. So essentially that's how they get paid. So the state wants to know how many workers showed up at a work site and which work they did, and whether they showed up for each day, which days they showed up, right? So that's the attendance register, and usually not be seen by anybody. It's done at the local level and kept here. The bureaucracy said, well, let's just digitize them, right? So we want to see it. The high level bureaucrats sitting in the state capital, they want to see this data in an aggregate way. They said, well, we'll capture the data at the field site, and then we'll digitize them. So the idea is to kind of, in his own words, his idea, their idea is like once all the applications are entered in the computer, you could essentially start having payroll generated automatically. you don't need to kind of have any decisions being made. Once you have basic data entered, the system will kind of take care of itself in autopilot, and the MIS system will run it. And so that's the kind of idea. And as some of you are already noticing, so somebody's entering the data, right, digitizing it. Yes, it looks nice. There's a digitized master roll now. You have an aggregate sense of the list of names, their CAS, how many days they worked, how much money they got, which account number. But there is some human being involved in actually entering the data. So how do you know whether you replace from paper to computer, and what changed, right? I mean, it's something they found. Not surprisingly, that nothing changed. I mean, some things changed because there's some visibility to it, but still collusion happened. So the next thing they did was they said, so as I said, local bureaucracy still have the ability to fudge the data, right? So the next thing they did was, well, instead of having just digitizing the data at the mandal level, let's capture the data using a mobile phone, give it to the lower bureaucrat, and reduce the kind of collusion time that's usually available, because if they want to kind of remove any middleman involved at the intermediate mandal level, and essentially force the lower bureaucrats to enter the attendance register, in this case, records, immediately at 11 a.m. in the morning using a phone. So he doesn't, the idea is that the field assistant, who's the lower bureaucrat, is different from a computer operator, who is usually digitized. They can fudge and they can take more time to do it. So let's kind of reduce the delay and digitize the process early on. And so the idea was like work site to website, so they can immediately see what's happening. And well, I mean, not surprisingly, it's not clear how do you trust the lower bureaucrats? They already figured out what to enter based on data. So the bureaucrats realized, the high level bureaucrats saw this and said, well, there's no way to tell whether the data that is now captured on a mobile phone, so points to like the mobile phone hype, right? So the Andhra government clearly is caught into this thing of, well, we'll solve this problem. But then I think, to be fair with the Andhra government, they said, well, we're not going to stop here. They said that we will now we create another process which is not technology, which will let a supervisor know. Randomly, we'll assign a supervisor, tell them how many people showed up on a phone, give them a smartphone, and say, instead of just getting to the server, we give them a phone. So every day there'll be a supervisor who's randomly assigned to go inspect field site. So his job is, he's got a phone in his hand, he will go to the field site, he'll compare the records that he sees in the field in the phone with the number of people who showed up. So at 11 o'clock in the morning, you can actually tell, is there any difference, right? And again, there's suspicious lenses or critical lenses. We can say, well, how do you trust the supervisor? So, well, Andhra didn't stop there. They said, well, we'll figure that out using more technologies. They said, we'll use a smartphone, and we'll geotag the smartphone. So a smartphone has capabilities of knowing where you are in location, right? So we can location tag the phone. So they give that smartphone to the supervisor. And they've already done geocoding of the location data, right? Every work site in Andhra has been tagged. It's a huge process where they went and said, well, the work site is this latitude, longitude, right? So they know, so when they can track whether the supervisor is actually going to the field site or not, or is sitting in his office and entering the data, right? So I was there watching this, and I was thinking, is this really working? So I noticed like bunch of the supervisors were not actually going to the field site. And in some cases they were, so the reports, there's something called a deviation report, they call it. So the report shows that in many cases the supervisors were 40 kilometers away from the field site, and you can tell. And I asked the bureaucrat, so you have this nice report, you've gathered the intelligence, and it tells you where the supervisor is. And the bureaucrat kind of looked at me and said, Rajesh, how many people can I fire? Like, a lot of people are kind of, reporting this. So it points to the fact that with technology, you could see more, right? You can find these problems, but they're still fundamentally limited by the hierarchy that I showed you earlier in terms of the scale of the operation, right? So the hierarchy is still the same. So a bureaucrat can see all this data, but what can you do with it, right? If a lot of people are not showing up. So that's something I saw. And even more, sadly, but interestingly, that I noticed the supervisors, to save this embarrassment, to save kind of even avoid this problem, they started giving phones to somebody else. So the phones travel to the work site. So if you look at the attendance, the supervisors don't go there. It's being recorded at the field site. But every level you see an iteration, fixing, changing, and they deal with like the local resistance, and it's a continuous process, right? And I don't know where, maybe they'll end up getting a chip on everybody's body, but it is a kind of evolving thing. As you can see, there's constant change in implementation, right? And at every stage, corruption actually has come down. It's not. I'm not trying to paint a picture of just a story of just changing material. I mean, if you see here, there's a change in materiality, right? You have paper, there's phone, there's location-based tagging. You're getting deviation reports getting produced, but and you have physical phone getting traveled. But I think the point I want to make in this story so far is that there's not a static endeavor where they throw some technology and wait. Every step of the way, there's constant renegotiation and designing of technology, right? So that's something I want to kind of take away. This next example is this, again, everybody wants this, at least the bureaucracy. They want to kind of eliminate local political interference. I mean, this is something that, it's a bureaucratic wish list, right? They're from their mind, it's a political process. Anything you want to do, want to follow rules that cannot be followed because it's been captured at the